There was a certain kind of quiet that only the dead could hear. Dorian Blackwood knew this well as he sat in the darkened study of his family's ancestral mansion, his fingers trailing lightly over the pages of a century-old ledger. The smell of dust and leather filled the air as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across the room like ghosts of his past. He should have felt at peace, his inheritance, his empire, and his family name all within reach, yet there was something deeply unsettling in the silence that surrounded him. It wasn't just the lack of voices or laughter, but a far more profound stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. It had been years since Dorian had truly called this mansion home, years since his father had given him the ultimatum: accept the Blackwood legacy or walk away. He chose the latter, turning his back on the life that had been laid out before him. Now his decision felt like an ache that lingered in the very marrow of his bones. But the truth was, no matter how far he ran, no matter how many cities he lived in or how many names he assumed, he could never outrun the Blackwood name. It was woven into him, a part of his very blood. It was a legacy both glorious and cursed, built on secrets and power, violence and betrayal. And now, as he sat alone in the study of that great empty house, it had come to reclaim him. The Blackwood family had built an empire that spanned continents, immense wealth, untold power and influence that reached the highest levels of government, business, and even the underworld. Dorian had been born into this world, destined to inherit it all. But there was a coldness in their dealings, a ruthless streak that ran through the Blackwood bloodline like a dark river. His father, Julian Blackwood, had been a towering figure, a man who ruled with an iron fist and a smile that could cut through steel. Julian had created an empire not just through business acumen, but by forging alliances with men and women who operated in the shadows. His power was a delicate balance, a web of transactions and covert agreements that kept the Blackwood name untouchable. But it was never enough for Julian. He had wanted more. For himself, for his family, for the legacy he planned to leave behind. He demanded that Dorian, his firstborn son, follow in his footsteps, that he would step into the role of heir to the empire. But Dorian was different. While his siblings, Charles and Eliza, embraced their roles as dutiful heirs, Dorian saw the cost of such a life. He wasn't blind to the undercurrents that held their world together. Deals made in dark corners, bloodshed that was justified for the sake of the family's future. At 23, Dorian left the mansion for the first time. He walked away from his family, from the expectations, from the cold, suffocating grip of the Blackwood legacy. He had everything a young man could desire: money, status, and the world at his fingertips. But in his heart, he carried a profound emptiness, a question that had haunted him for years. Was this all there? He disappeared into the world, leaving behind his family's mansion, his name, and the legacy that had been forged for him. He settled in New York, taking up the life of an artist, far from the boardrooms and business deals of his past. Here, he could finally breathe. He painted. He wrote. He lived among people who saw him as nothing more than another struggling artist, a man trying to make a name for himself without the weight of his bloodline pulling him down. For a time, it felt like freedom. But even in his new life, Dorian could feel the pull of the Blackwood legacy, its invisible chains that wound around his wrists and ankles. The name was always with him, haunting him in the quiet moments, whispering in the back of his mind. The mansion in England, the sprawling estate in Italy, the boardrooms and city streets, none of it could ever be truly left behind. The letter arrived one stormy evening, its heavy weight thudding against the floor as it slipped through the crack beneath his apartment door. Dorian stared at it for a long moment, the seal bearing the Blackwood crest. He hadn't received a letter from his family in years, not since the day he walked away. With a sigh, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he read. Dorian, it began, "Your father has passed." The words struck him like a blow to the chest. Julian Blackwood, the man who had shaped him, broken him, and pushed him away, was gone. Dorian hadn't expected to feel anything. He hadn't expected to grieve, not after everything. But as he read on, his mind began to race. His father's death meant the end of an era. The Blackwood Empire was now in the hands of his younger brother, Charles, the man who had always followed in their father's footsteps, the man who had never questioned the darkness that lay at the heart of their family. The letter continued, "We need you to return. The family cannot move forward without you. The legacy demands your presence. There are things that must be settled, and you are the only one who can see them through." Dorian stood in front of the mansion once again, the weight of his father's death and his family's summons pressing down on him. He had left this place behind thinking he could escape its clutches. But now, as he walked through the grand gates, the mansion seemed to beckon him, its windows dark and foreboding, as though the house itself was waiting for him to return. Inside, the mansion was as grand as he remembered, but it felt different. The silence was more oppressive now, and the air seemed thicker, charged with a presence that Dorian couldn't quite place. He could feel the weight of the walls closing in on him, the legacy that had been thrust upon him now more palpable than ever. His brother Charles met him at the door. The same cold eyes, the same sharp smile. The man who had inherited everything Dorian had walked away from. "I knew you would come back," Charles said, his voice laced with both triumph and something darker, something Dorian couldn't quite name. "So you can't run from your blood, Dorian. You can't escape what you are." That night, Dorian couldn't sleep. The mansion seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand. There were things about his family, things he'd never known, hidden within these walls. Things that his father had kept secret, things that Dorian was now forced to face. Dorian wandered the halls, drawn to the library, his father's sanctuary. As he pushed open the heavy doors, he found it just as he remembered. Shelves upon shelves of books, the faint smell of old paper in the air. But there, at the far end of the room, hidden beneath a stack of books, was a journal. This journal, unlike the others, was worn and aged. The pages were brittle, and the cover was scrawled with symbols that were unfamiliar to Dorian. He opened it carefully, and the first words he read made his blood run cold. The Blackwoods were never meant to be a family of merchants or kings. They were meant to be something far darker. Dorian's heart began to race as he continued reading, each sentence pulling him deeper into a web of darkness that he had never imagined. His family's legacy wasn't just about wealth or power, it was about something much more sinister. And now, as the heir to the Blackwood name, it was his destiny to carry on this legacy. But at what cost? Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that something more was hidden within the mansion's ancient walls. The journal had been only the beginning, a mere fragment of a much larger story, one that his family had kept buried for generations. He needed to understand the full extent of the Blackwood legacy, the good and the bad, the power and the curse. That night, after the rest of the family had retired to their chambers, Dorian found himself back in the library. The air was thick with the scent of aging leather and old books. He ran his hand over the pages of the journal again, his mind racing. There was one sentence that echoed in his thoughts. The Blackwoods were never meant to be a family of merchants or kings. They were meant to be something far darker. His eyes scanned the library, his fingers trailing across the wooden shelves until something caught his attention. A section of the wall that seemed slightly different from the others. A faint outline of a door, almost invisible to the naked eye. His pulse quickened as he pressed against it, and to his surprise, the door creaked open. Beyond the door, hidden in the depths of the mansion, was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. He hesitated for a moment, the cold air from below seeping up, but something inside him urged him forward. The Blackwoods had built their empire on secrets, and now Dorian was going to uncover the truth. He descended the stairs, the stone steps cold and damp beneath his feet. At the bottom, he found a large stone door, etched with the same symbols he had seen in the journal. His heart pounded as he pushed it open, revealing a hidden chamber. The chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen. Ancient artifacts lay scattered around the room, items that seemed to radiate an eerie energy. In the center of the room, there was a stone altar, and surrounding it were strange carvings and symbols that Dorian couldn't understand. It was here that the Blackwood legacy had been forged. As Dorian examined the chamber, his eyes were drawn to an old, weathered book placed upon the altar. He approached it slowly, the weight of its significance pressing down on him. The cover was inscribed with symbols that matched those in the journal, and as Dorian opened it, he discovered the horrifying truth. The Blackwoods had made a pact with an ancient force that existed far beyond the mortal realm. In exchange for power and prosperity, the Blackwoods had agreed to sacrifice the very souls of their descendants, ensuring that the family's wealth and influence would remain unchallenged. This pact had bound the Blackwoods to a dark entity, one that demanded payment with every generation. Dorian's hands trembled as he read the final passage of the book, which described a ritual that could either break the pact or seal it forever. It spoke of a chosen heir, one who would bear the sigil, the mark that had always been a part of Dorian's existence. The ritual required the heir to make a choice: accept the pact, embrace the power, and continue the legacy, or reject it, breaking the chain and freeing the family, but at the cost of their life. Dorian stepped back, his heart racing. The curse, the pact, everything he had known about his family, it all made sense now. His father had never told him the truth, but it was clear. Julian Blackwood had known what Dorian's role would be. The next morning, Dorian couldn't sleep. The weight of the decision that lay before him felt suffocating. He couldn't ignore what he had learned. His family's power, their fortune, their legacy. It had all been built on a dark, twisted foundation. His father, Julian, had known the truth, and it was clear now that he had pushed Dorian to take his place, to perpetuate the Blackwood Empire. But Dorian had always felt like an outsider in his own family. He had never wanted the power, the influence, or the bloodshed that came with it. He wanted to create something beautiful, something of his own, away from the dark shadows of the Blackwoods. Yet now the blood of his ancestors pulsed through his veins, and the sigil on his shoulder burned with a power he could neither deny nor control. The room felt like it was closing in on him as he stood before the mirror, staring at his reflection. The sigil had always been a part of him, but now it felt like a curse, a burden he could not shake. Would he follow in his father's footsteps, embracing the legacy and the power that came with it? Or would he choose to destroy it, knowing the cost would be his life? Dorian spent the next few days avoiding his family. He didn't want to face his brother, Charles, or his mother, who had always been a passive observer to the Blackwood legacy. Instead, he retreated to the mansion's garden, the one place that still felt like his own. The garden had been his sanctuary as a child, a place where he could escape from the world and retreat into his thoughts. But now even the garden seemed different. The once peaceful surroundings felt cold, suffocating. The birds no longer sang, and the flowers that bloomed in vibrant colors seemed to fade before his eyes. It was as if the very land around him was reacting to his turmoil, as if the legacy was beginning to take hold once more. The storm that had been building within Dorian finally broke when he received a visit from Charles. His younger brother had always been the golden child of the Blackwood family, the one who had embraced the legacy without question. Now Charles stood before him, the same cold smile on his lips, but there was something darker in his eyes. "You're wasting time, Dorian," Charles said, his voice smooth but edged with an unspoken threat. "You can't run from this. You're the heir. You have the sigil. The legacy is yours to claim." "I never wanted it," Dorian replied, his voice firm despite the storm brewing in his chest. "You don't have a choice," Charles retorted. "You may think you can break the pact, but you're wrong. If you don't take control, the legacy will consume you. The Blackwoods always find a way to make their heirs conform." Dorian stepped back, the weight of his brother's words crashing down on him. He had to make a choice, one that would either destroy him or define him. Dorian woke to a new day, his mind still reeling from the choices before him. The mansion, the family, the legacy. All of it had become a prison. The walls that had once seemed to offer protection now felt like they were closing in on him. In the early hours of the morning, he stood in front of the hidden chamber once more. The altar, the journal, the ancient symbols, they all seemed to beckon him, urging him to fulfill his destiny. But as Dorian stood there, he made a decision. He wouldn't let the Blackwood legacy define him any longer. He would face the consequences of his actions, but he would not bow to the dark forces that had shaped his family's fate. He would break the curse, no matter the cost. The storm outside grew fiercer, but Dorian knew what he had to do. As he stepped toward the altar, he prepared himself to make the ultimate sacrifice, knowing that in breaking the curse, he would forever change the course of the Blackwood legacy. The chamber was still, save for the wind howling outside. Dorian stood before the altar, the sigil on his shoulder burning with an intensity he had never felt before. The air was thick with the energy of the ritual, and he could hear the whispers of his ancestors, urging him to take his place. With a steady breath, Dorian placed his hands upon the altar. The journal lay open before him, its pages fluttering as if alive with the energy of the pact. He closed his eyes and spoke the incantation, the final words that would either break the curse or seal his fate. And as he uttered the last words, the world around him seemed to crack and tremble. The Blackwood legacy had finally come to an end. The moment Dorian uttered the final words of the incantation, a shockwave of energy swept through the chamber, radiating from the altar and spreading out like ripples in water. The air thickened, vibrating with an unnatural power. The sigil on his shoulder burned hotter than ever before, as if the mark itself were fighting against the decision he had made. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. The wind outside had stopped howling, and the world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Then it came, a blast of searing pain unlike anything he had ever known. It was as if his very soul were being torn from his body, dragged through the very fabric of reality. His vision blurred, and his knees buckled beneath him. The journal that had guided him through this cursed ritual slipped from his hands, its pages fluttering open to the part where the Blackwoods had sealed their pact with the dark forces. He heard voices. No, whispers from the past. The Blackwood ancestors whose very lives had been entwined with the pact. Their voices were like a chorus of ghosts, rising and falling in a dissonant melody. You can never escape it. You are bound to us. The price will be paid. But Dorian gritted his teeth and pushed through the pain, his hands trembling as he clutched the altar. No. He would not let them claim him. He had made his choice, and he would live with it, whatever the cost. The pain suddenly stopped, as if the world had exhaled in unison. The air cleared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Dorian could breathe again. He staggered to his feet, disoriented but alive, the mark on his shoulder now faded, its burn extinguished. He had done it. The curse was broken. But there was no celebration, no relief. Instead, there was a deep, unsettling emptiness that filled the chamber, as though something had been lost forever. Dorian had expected anything to happen after the ritual. A burst of light, a moment of triumph. Yet when he opened his eyes, the world was exactly the same. There were no mystical apparitions, no sudden transformation, only the quiet, oppressive silence that had pervaded the mansion for so long. As he stood there, confused and exhausted, Dorian realized that breaking the pact had not erased the Blackwood legacy. It had not cleansed the mansion of its dark history. It had only torn away the last vestiges of his connection to it. The empire, the name, the power, they were no longer his. The Blackwood fortune was gone, its dark power dissipating like smoke in the wind. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse had come to replace it. The emptiness in his chest grew, not from the loss of wealth, but from the realization that in breaking the chain he had erased a part of himself. The Blackwoods may have been cursed, but they were also his bloodline. They had been the foundation of his existence, and without them he was adrift, lost. He left the chamber, his body still trembling, and wandered through the mansion. It was now eerily silent. The walls seemed colder, the shadows deeper. Every room he entered felt as if it had been abandoned for centuries. Even his mother's portrait, once a reminder of the family he had left behind, now seemed distant, as though it too had been erased from history. The following days passed in a haze. Dorian couldn't return to New York, not yet, not while the weight of what he had done lingered like a ghost at his heels. He was free from the Blackwood legacy, but he had no idea what to do with that freedom. His thoughts turned back to the letter he had received days before, his father's death. Dorian knew that his return to the mansion had been more than just a personal journey. It was part of something much larger. A reckoning had taken place, but the family was not entirely gone. And, as he sat in his room contemplating his next move, the door to his chamber creaked open and someone entered without knocking. Charles. The last person Dorian had expected to see was standing in the doorway, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on him. The older brother Dorian had always outshone. The one who had always followed in their father's footsteps without question. "Do you feel it?" Charles asked, his voice low but steady, carrying with it the same weight it always had, one of authority and control. "The emptiness?" Dorian looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Charles smiled, but it was a smile without warmth, a smile full of bitter knowledge. "The Blackwood legacy is not just a name, it's a force, a bloodline, a curse. You think you can break it, but you can't. It's in your blood, Dorian. You've freed yourself from the shackles of wealth and power, but you've also freed something else, the darkness that always follows us." Dorian's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The Blackwoods were never meant to be free," Charles continued, his tone darkening. "We are bound to something far greater than wealth, something far darker. Even now I can feel it. The power we once controlled is slipping away, but it's not gone. It's here, inside us." Dorian's stomach twisted with dread. "What are you saying?" Charles stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that the legacy you thought you broke, it's coming for you, Dorian, and it's coming for me too, but this time we'll be its masters. We'll wield the power that was meant to consume us." As the days passed, Dorian's fears began to take shape. The mansion was no longer just a house, it was a living thing, breathing and watching. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind seemed to whisper to him, urging him to accept his fate. The mark on his shoulder had faded, but the legacy, the curse, the darkness, it had not disappeared. Charles had been right about one thing. The Blackwood legacy could never be truly broken. It was bound to them by blood, by pact, by force. And now, as the last remaining heir, Dorian was, once again, at its mercy. But Dorian would not accept it. He would fight. He would not be consumed by the darkness that had haunted his family for centuries. With newfound resolve, Dorian left the mansion once more, this time not to escape, but to face whatever was coming. He would find the source of the Blackwood legacy's power and destroy it, once and for all. But as he walked away from the mansion, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking his path. It was his mother. "You cannot leave, Dorian," she said softly, her voice trembling. "There's nowhere left to run." The weight of her words crushed him, but Dorian knew what he had to do. He had freed himself from the Blackwood legacy, but in doing so, he had uncovered a far greater enemy, one that he would have to face alone. The storm that had been brewing within Dorian was finally reaching its peak, and the Blackwood legacy was awakening, more powerful than ever before. Dorian's journey had only just begun. The truth he had uncovered was only the beginning of a battle that would define his life. The Blackwood legacy, the dark power that had haunted his family for centuries, was not finished. It was alive, and it was coming for him. But this time, Dorian would not run. He would stand his ground. He would fight for his freedom, for his soul, and for the future of the Blackwood name that had forgotten him. The final confrontation was imminent, and Dorian Blackwood, the heir who had turned his back on the past, was about to reclaim his fate. Dorian walked through the crumbling corridors of the Blackwood mansion, his heart pounding with each step. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "There's nowhere left to run." The weight of those words pressed on him like a physical force. But this time, he wasn't running. He couldn't. The mansion, once a place of suffocating power, had become his battleground. The curse, the legacy, the very essence of his family, it was all coming to a head. The walls of the mansion, once filled with the echoes of family celebrations and the bustle of servants, were now silent. The paintings of his ancestors, once proud and unyielding, now seemed to stare down at him with empty eyes. The Blackwood name had always been synonymous with power. But that power had a cost, and Dorian had seen it firsthand. As he approached the grand staircase, he felt the familiar tug in his chest, the pull of the legacy, the weight of generations pushing against him. He was the last of the Blackwood heirs. And now, he was the one who had to end it. At the top of the stairs, Charles stood waiting, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. Dorian had known this confrontation was coming. Charles had always been the one to follow their father's path, to embrace the power that had been handed down to them. He had never questioned it, never hesitated. But now, there was something different in his eyes, something darker. "You've come to face me, Dorian?" Charles asked, his voice smooth. But there was an edge to it. "You've broken the curse. But you don't understand what you've done. You've freed the Blackwood legacy, but you've also released something far more dangerous." Dorian didn't flinch. His resolve had solidified over the past few days. He had seen what his family had been hiding, the blood-soaked history they had tried to bury. The power that had sustained them for generations was not just born of wealth. It was born of sacrifice, of dark rituals, of a price that could never be paid in full. "I understand more than you think," Dorian said, his voice steady. "You're right, Charles. The curse is broken. But in breaking it, I've freed us from the chains that bound us to the darkness." Charles laughed, a low, humorless sound that echoed through the empty halls. "You think? You've broken free, but the Blackwood name is not something you can escape. It's not just a name, Dorian. It's power. And that power is not gone. It's inside us. It's in our blood." Dorian stepped forward, his eyes locked onto his brother's. "That's where you're wrong. The power we wield is not ours to control. It never was. It was given to us by forces we couldn't understand. But I understand now. I understand what it will cost." Charles's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "What are you saying?" Dorian's gaze hardened. "I'm saying it ends now. The Blackwood legacy ends here, with me." The mansion seemed to come alive around them. The air crackled with energy, the weight of the past bearing down on both brothers as they stood facing each other in the grand hall. The storm outside had reached its peak, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating the darkened mansion. The wind howled through the broken windows, as if nature itself was reacting to the tension in the air. Charles's eyes narrowed, and his hands clenched into fists. "You can't defeat me, Dorian. You don't have the strength to stand against me. You never have." Dorian felt the familiar surge of power within him, the legacy that flowed through his veins. He had always known it was there, buried beneath the surface. But now he realized that it was not a gift, it was a curse. And in this moment he had to decide how to wield it. Would he allow it to control him? Or would he finally be the one to break free from its grip? "I don't need to defeat you, Charles," Dorian said, his voice low and dangerous. "I need to end this. End everything." Without warning, Charles lunged forward, his hands outstretched as if to seize Dorian by the throat. But Dorian was faster. With a swift motion, he stepped to the side, narrowly avoiding Charles' grasp. The power within him flared to life, the sigil on his shoulder burning once more. But this time, Dorian did not resist it. Instead, he embraced it. The room seemed to shake as the energy between them collided. Charles' eyes widened in shock as Dorian's power surged forth, his hand reaching out to seize his brother's wrist. The two stood locked in a battle of wills, the ancient power of the Blackwood bloodline swirling between them, the curse that had bound their family now fully awakened. "You don't understand, Dorian," Charles gasped, struggling to break free. "This is our birthright, our destiny." "No," Dorian snarled, tightening his grip. "This was never our destiny. It was a lie, a trap, and I'm not going to let it consume me any longer." With a final burst of energy, Dorian pushed Charles away, sending him stumbling backward. The force of the impact knocked over a nearby vase, its shards scattering across the floor. The two Brothers stood panting, their eyes locked in a silent standoff. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Charles spoke, his voice tinged with something that Dorian couldn't quite place. "You may think you've won, Dorian. But you're wrong. The Blackwood legacy is not something you can destroy. It will never be gone. It will always find a way back." Dorian stood tall, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "Maybe you're right, Charles. Maybe it won't ever be gone. But I can choose not to carry it. I choose to let it die with me." The silence that followed felt endless. The battle was over, but Dorian knew that the war was just beginning. The Blackwood legacy had been shattered, but the echoes of its past would continue to haunt him. As Charles turned and walked away, leaving the mansion behind, Dorian felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The legacy that had consumed his family for generations, the legacy that had forgotten him, was finally coming to an end. And with it, he would finally be free. But as he stood in the empty mansion, the remnants of his family's empire scattered around him, Dorian couldn't help but wonder, what now? The world outside had changed, and Dorian knew that his place in it had shifted. The power, the wealth, the influence, all of it was gone. But for the first time in his life, Dorian felt like he could breathe. He had no name to live up to, no legacy to carry. He was his own man. And for the first time, he felt the promise of something new, something that had been buried deep within him all along. Days turned into weeks, and Dorian slowly began to rebuild his life. He returned to New York, where he had once found solace. The art he had once turned to for escape now became his focus, his true passion. The mansion, the legacy, the darkness. It was all behind him. But as he walked down the busy streets of the city, he knew one thing for certain. The legacy that had forgotten him had not defeated him. He had rewritten it, and in doing so had set himself free. The Blackwood name may have been lost to history, but Dorian Blackwood, the man, was reborn. Dorian's return to New York felt almost surreal. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, had always been a place of anonymity, a place where he could lose himself in the crowd. But now it felt different, charged with a sense of possibility, yet shadowed by the weight of everything he had left behind. The apartment he had rented when he first arrived years ago, seeking escape from the Blackwood mansion, was now both a sanctuary and a reminder of the life he had fled. The walls, once barren, were now lined with his paintings, works that had been his sole solace in the darkest of times. They were chaotic, raw, and unrefined, expressions of a soul torn between two worlds, one of wealth and power, and one of isolation and despair. But now, they were his truth. His art was no longer a way to escape the family he had rejected. It was his way of claiming his own identity, of expressing the rawness of his emotions, his pain, and most importantly, his newfound freedom. As he stared at the latest canvas, a swirling mass of colors and shapes that seemed to pulse with life, Dorian felt something stir deep within him. The weight that had burdened him for years was finally lifting. The darkness of the Blackwood legacy, while still lingering in his memory, no longer had the power to control him. He had broken the chains, but it wasn't until now, standing alone in his studio, that he truly understood the depth of what he had done. Though Dorian had left the Blackwood mansion behind, the past was not so easily forgotten. Everywhere he turned, he found reminders of the family he had been born into, the legacy he had rejected. Even in the vibrant streets of New York, there were whispers, rumors of the Blackwood name, the power that had once been theirs, and the mystery surrounding Dorian's sudden disappearance. But he didn't care. He didn't want to be defined by his family's past, by their mistakes. He wanted to be free, truly free. And for the first time, he realized that meant letting go of everything. That was when he met Clara. Clara was unlike anyone Dorian had ever known. She wasn't impressed by his name, his art, or the mysteries that surrounded him. She was simple, yet profound, a woman who lived for the moment, who embraced life without the weight of family expectations or societal pressure. She was the kind of person who could see through the layers of Dorian's guarded exterior. She didn't see the Blackwood heir. She saw him, the man behind the name, Their first meeting had been entirely by chance, at a small cafe tucked away in the corner of the city, far from the glitz and glamour of his former life. Clara had been sitting alone, reading a book, when Dorian had walked in, looking for a place to escape the noise of the city. They exchanged a few words, as strangers often do. But there was something about her, something that made Dorian feel less alone in the world. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care. And for Dorian, that was everything. Days turned into weeks, and Dorian found himself drawn to Clara in ways he hadn't anticipated. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and discovering the quiet joy of being in each other's company without the weight of history hanging over them. Clara had no interest in the Blackwood name or the legacy Dorian had escaped. She had grown up in a small town, raised by parents who had never been concerned with wealth or status. She valued the simple things: honesty, kindness, and the freedom to live without the pressures of expectation. In her presence, Dorian felt like he could breathe again. For the first time in years, he wasn't haunted by the past. But as his relationship with Clara deepened, so did the realization that the past would always be with him. He couldn't erase the Blackwood name from the world. He couldn't erase the pain of his family's legacy. But Clara showed him that he didn't have to carry it alone. He could choose who he wanted to be, and with her by his side, he could build a future that was entirely his own. It was with Clara that Dorian began to take the first steps toward truly freeing himself. He sold his art for the first time, not to fund his escape from his past, but to create something new, something that belonged to him, not to the Blackwoods. The paintings he once considered unfinished or chaotic were now seen as masterpieces by the public. The raw emotion in each brushstroke spoke to others, resonating with people who understood what it meant to break free from the chains of their own histories. Despite the newfound sense of peace that Clara brought into his life, Dorian couldn't ignore the call of the Blackwood legacy forever. His paintings were gaining recognition, and he was slowly rebuilding his life. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching him. It wasn't until an unexpected visitor knocked on his door that Dorian realized how closely his past was still following him. One evening, as Dorian sat in his studio, Clara at his side, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find a man he hadn't seen in years, a man who was once a friend of the family, a man who had been one of his father's closest allies. "Dorian Blackwood," the man said, his eyes cold and calculating. "I've come to speak with you about your inheritance." The mention of the word inheritance made Dorian's stomach churn. It was a word he had hoped never to hear again. But the man before him wasn't offering Dorian the opportunity to reclaim the Blackwood Empire. No, this man had come to remind him of something darker, something that Dorian had buried deep within him. "We have unfinished business, Mr. Blackwood," the man continued. "Your family's legacy may have been broken, but there are still debts to be paid, and I'm here to collect." Dorian's heart raced as he stood in the doorway, staring at the man who had once been part of his father's inner circle. He had tried so hard to escape the Blackwood legacy, to break free from the darkness that had defined his family. But now, the past had come to find him. "What do you want?" Dorian asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. The man smirked. "Your name, Mr. Blackwood, may have been erased from the records, but the debts your family owes are still very much alive. The Blackwood legacy was built on blood, and it is time for you to pay the price." Dorian stood tall, every muscle in his body tense. He had broken the curse, but it seemed that breaking free from the Blackwood legacy wasn't as simple as leaving the mansion behind. The debts of the past, the darkness that had shaped his family, were still hunting him. But this time, Dorian was ready. This time, he would not back down. "You don't own me anymore," Dorian said, his voice unwavering. "The Blackwood legacy ends with me." With that, Dorian slammed the door in the man's face, feeling the final shackle of his past break away. As the days passed, Dorian knew that he had truly begun to carve out a new life for himself. The Blackwood name no longer haunted him. His art had become a symbol of his freedom, and with Clara by his side, he finally understood what it meant to live without the weight of his family's legacy. Dorian had chosen his path. He had broken free, and now he was free to live a life of his own. Making. The Blackwood legacy may have forgotten him, but he had rewritten his own story. And this time, it was a story worth living. The city outside was buzzing with life, as it always had been. Yet for Dorian, each passing day felt more and more like a new chapter, a chapter in which he had control, but also one that demanded reflection and introspection. The Blackwood mansion was behind him, but its influence still lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't fully dissipate. Dorian had spent years running from his legacy, from his bloodline, and from the suffocating grip of power that had been passed down to him through generations. Yet, despite his escape, he couldn't help but feel the weight of that legacy pressing against him. The darkness, the violence, the ancient secrets, they had been woven into the fabric of his very identity. Could he ever truly erase them, or was he doomed to carry their echoes forever? It was in the quiet moments, when Clara was out or when he was alone in his studio, that Dorian allowed himself to confront these questions. He would stare at the blank canvas in front of him, his brush in hand, and feel the immense pressure to create something that wasn't tainted by the Blackwoods. He knew he could paint, he had proven that. But could he create something pure, something that wasn't linked to the past? Something that truly represented him? One evening, after a particularly grueling day in the studio, Dorian stood by his window, staring out at the horizon as the sun set behind the city's skyline. The world outside seemed to be full of possibilities, yet Dorian felt strangely disconnected from it all. His thoughts turned to his family, his mother, Charles, his ancestors, and he wondered if they too had ever struggled with this feeling of disconnection. Had they ever wanted to break free? He wondered. Had they ever felt the suffocating grip of their own power and wondered what it would be like to leave it all behind? He had never gotten answers to those questions. His father, Julian, had never shown any vulnerability, any sign that he too had felt trapped. Julian had been driven by ambition, by the thirst for control, and Dorian had been forced to follow in those footsteps, until he could run no more. But running had cost him. He had left behind everything, the mansion, the empire, his father's expectations. He had freed himself from the past, but that freedom came with a cost he hadn't fully understood. It was Clara who finally broke through the fog of his thoughts one evening. She had been watching him for weeks, noticing the distance in his eyes, the way he seemed to withdraw into himself when they were alone. She had always known there was more to Dorian than the guarded exterior he put on. He wasn't just the rebellious heir to a cursed legacy, he was a man, haunted by his past and the choices that had shaped him. One evening, as Dorian sat at his easel, staring at an unfinished painting, Clara approached him. Her footsteps were quiet, and she stood behind him for a moment before speaking. "You're running again," she said softly. Dorian didn't respond immediately. He kept his eyes on the canvas, as though the strokes of paint might answer her. "I'm not running," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to figure out who I am now." Clara sat beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "I don't think you'll find the answers in your paintings, Dorian. They're beautiful, yes, but they're not the key to your past. You don't need to hide behind your art." Dorian sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of her words. "I thought I could. I thought if I painted something beautiful, something worth sharing, I could erase all the darkness. But every time I look at it, I see the Blackwoods staring back at me." Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to erase them, Dorian. The Blackwood legacy is a part of you, whether you want it to be or not. But it doesn't have to define you. The man you are now, that is what matters. And that man is not your father. He's not Charles. He's you." Her words sank deep into Dorian's soul. For the first time, he realized something that he had been avoiding. He had spent so much time trying to outrun his past, trying to tear it away from him, that he had never truly accepted it. The Blackwood legacy was a part of him, yes, but it didn't have to control him. He could shape his future with the pieces of his past, not by rejecting them, but by accepting them fully and forging a new path forward. The realization hit Dorian with the force of a revelation. For the past few months he had been running, not just from his family but from himself. He had been trying to outrun the weight of his name, the legacy of his ancestors, and in doing so, he had cut himself off from the very thing that made him who he was. His story. Dorian wasn't just the son of Julian Blackwood. He wasn't just the heir to a dark legacy. He was Dorian Blackwood, a man who had chosen his own path, who had broken free from the chains of his family, and who had the power to reclaim his story. It was time to stop hiding, to stop pretending that the Blackwood name didn't matter. It did matter, but only because it had shaped him, had made him who he was. He couldn't change his bloodline, but he could change the way he lived with it. He could choose how to move forward. And in that choice, there was freedom. With Clara's encouragement, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. He would no longer run from his legacy. He would own it. But in doing so, he would reshape it, not as a cursed empire, but as a testament to the man he had become. The next few months were a blur of change. Dorian threw himself into his art with a renewed sense of purpose. His paintings, once chaotic and raw, began to take on a new form, one that was both beautiful and haunting, a reflection of his inner journey. He didn't shy away from the darkness anymore. Instead, he embraced it, weaving it into his work in a way that felt honest and cathartic. He also began to engage with his past in ways he hadn't before. He reached out to distant relatives, to old friends of the Blackwood family, seeking to understand the full scope of what his legacy truly was. And as he did, he realized something profound. The Blackwood name wasn't all darkness. There were moments of beauty, moments of sacrifice, and moments of true love in his family's history. They were tangled up in a web of power and corruption, but they were there, waiting to be acknowledged. Dorian began to rebuild his reputation, not as the son of Julian Blackwood, but as an artist and a man who had chosen his own path. His art began to be displayed in galleries across the world, not just as a reflection of his talent, but as a reflection of his journey. And with each piece he was reclaiming his story, turning the Blackwood legacy into something new, something that would outlive him. One evening, as Dorian stood before a new canvas, Clara by his side, he realized that his journey had come full circle. The man who had once run from his past, who had tried to erase the Blackwood name from his life, was now a man who had embraced it. He had learned to live with the weight of his legacy, not as a burden, but as a part of who he was. And in doing so, he had freed himself from its grip. Clara smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride and understanding. "You did it, Dorian. You've created something new." Dorian nodded, a quiet smile playing at his lips. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time in his life, he knew that it would be his to create. The Blackwood legacy might have forgotten him, but he had rewritten it, and in doing so had created a legacy of his own, one that would stand the test of time. It had been months since Dorian had made his decision to reclaim his past, to reshape the Blackwood legacy in his own image. But freedom, as he quickly learned, was fragile. It was not something that could be claimed once and for all, but something that required constant vigilance. Every day, Dorian had to remind himself that he was no longer bound by the chains of his family's dark history. Yet, even in his newfound peace, there were moments when he felt the weight of his past creeping back in. One evening, after a particularly taxing day in the studio, Dorian sat by the window in his apartment, staring out at the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, a reminder of the vast world outside his small private bubble. Clara had gone out with friends, leaving him to wrestle with his thoughts alone. The silence was almost unbearable, and it was in these moments of solitude that Dorian felt the weight of the Blackwood legacy the most. He had built a life for himself, one that was free from the expectations of his father, free from the darkness that had once consumed him. But as much as he had freed himself from the Blackwood name, it still clung to him. The question of whether he could ever truly escape it haunted him. It was just before dawn when Dorian received the phone call. He had been asleep, but the ring of his phone cut through the silence like a knife. He groggily picked up the receiver, his mind still foggy with sleep. "Dorian?" a familiar voice said, cold and unyielding. It's time. It was Charles. Dorian's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from his brother in months, not since their confrontation at the mansion. Charles had seemed to disappear, vanishing from Dorian's life as quickly as he had entered it. But now, here he was again, pulling Dorian back into the storm he had tried so hard to escape. What do you want, Charles? Dorian's voice was low, edged with the exhaustion of dealing with his past. You know exactly what I want, Charles replied. The Blackwood legacy isn't something you can walk away from. It's in your blood, Dorian, and it's time you faced it. Dorian's jaw clenched. He had faced his past. He had made his decision. The legacy no longer held sway over him. Or so he thought. I told you before, Charles, Dorian said firmly. I'm done with it. I'm done with all of it. There was a silence on the other end of the line, followed by a chuckle. You can't run from this, Dorian. The Blackwood name is too powerful. You can never truly escape it. The words struck Dorian like a blow to the chest. Could he really escape it? As the line went dead, Dorian sat in the darkness, his mind racing. The Blackwood name, the legacy, was more than just power. It was a curse, a shadow that would forever loom over him, no matter how far he ran. The next day, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He couldn't look at his art the same way, couldn't paint without feeling like something was missing. The peace he had found with Clara, with the life they had begun to build together, now felt uncertain. The weight of the Blackwood legacy was pressing down on him once again, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, it seemed inescapable. It was Clara who noticed the change first. She had come to his apartment in the evening after a long day at work. When she saw the way he was pacing around the studio, his brow furrowed, she immediately recognized that something was wrong. Talk to me, she said, her voice gentle but insistent. You've been distant all day. What's going on? Dorian stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with the weight of everything he was feeling. Clara had always been his safe space, the one person who understood him without judgment. But now, even with her by his side, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was slipping away. I heard from Charles, Dorian said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. He's trying to drag me back into the Blackwood legacy. He's trying to make me believe that I can never truly escape it. Clara walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm, her touch soft but grounding. You don't have to let him control you, Dorian. You've already chosen your path. You've already broken free. Dorian looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. But have I? What if Charles is right? What if the legacy is too powerful for me to escape? Clara smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. It's not the legacy that controls you, Dorian. It's you who controls it. You've already proven that you can choose your own path. You don't need to let anyone, not even Charles, pull you back into that world. Dorian took a deep breath, his heart slowly beginning to calm. He knew Clara was right. He had chosen to leave the Blackwood legacy behind. He had created something for himself, a life, a future, and a love that was his own. And as long as he held on to that, nothing from his past could take it away. Despite the strength of his resolve, Dorian couldn't ignore the fact that the Blackwood legacy was not something that could be so easily dismissed. Charles had returned, and with him came the weight of everything Dorian had tried to escape. It was as though the world was testing him, testing his commitment to his newfound freedom. Weeks passed, and the pressure from his past mounted. Charles was relentless, sending letters and making more phone calls, each one more desperate than the last. Dorian's art was no longer a refuge. It was a battleground where he fought against the ghosts of his ancestors. But one day, as he sat in his studio, paintbrush in hand, Dorian realized something. The Blackwood legacy was not just a curse. It had been his inheritance, yes, but it was also his foundation. His art, his struggle, his growth, everything that had shaped him came from his lineage. It was time to stop running from it. He would not let the Blackwood name control him, but he would not reject it either. It was part of him, a part that he could use to build something new, not just for himself but for the future. Dorian's next painting would be his most daring yet. It was not just a work of art, it was a statement, a declaration of everything he had fought for. The canvas was large, stretching. Across the wall of his studio, a space he had once considered too small for the weight of his emotions. He painted with abandon, his brushstrokes raw and unrefined. The image that emerged from the chaos was a figure standing tall in the midst of a storm. A figure of power, but not one born of darkness. The figure was Dorian, standing at the crossroads of his past and future, surrounded by the swirling remnants of the Blackwood legacy, but standing firm, unyielding. It was a painting that reflected not just his own personal journey, but the journey of anyone who had ever felt trapped by their past. It was about breaking free, but not erasing the past. It was about choosing to redefine it. As Dorian stood back and looked at the finished piece, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He had finally come to terms with his family's legacy. It would never define him, but it would always be a part of him, and that was enough. Dorian stood at the top of a hill, Clara by his side, watching the sunrise over the city. The air was crisp and fresh, a new day beginning with endless possibilities. The storm that had raged within him had passed, and now there was only the calm. The Blackwood legacy had forgotten him once, but now he had rewritten it. He had taken control of his own story, and with Clara at his side, he was ready to face whatever the future held. The past would always be there, but it no longer had the power to define him. He had found his freedom, not by running from his family, but by embracing everything he had learned from them, the good and the bad, and forging a path that was his own. And in that freedom, he found peace. Though Dorian had freed himself from the Blackwood legacy in many ways, the past had a way of catching up with him. Even as he found peace in his art and his relationship with Clara, the echoes of his ancestors lingered in subtle ways. The paintings on his walls were no longer simply creations. They were a mirror, reflecting his internal battles. Each stroke was a conversation with his past, and as he grew, so too did the complexity of his art. But even the world of art, which had once provided him solace, became another battleground. Galleries wanted to label him, to define him as the son of Blackwood, as though his bloodline alone was his identity. It was a constant reminder that, no matter how far he had come, people were unwilling to let go of the name they had known. He had taken steps to distance himself from the world that once dictated his every move. His art, exhibitions, his work, it was all about the man he had become. But still, whispers followed him. Whispers that traced his success back to the Blackwood name. Whispers that demanded answers. It wasn't until one evening, in the midst of a major art exhibition, that Dorian realized how deeply his family's shadow still loomed over him. The gallery was bustling with visitors, but Dorian felt disconnected from the energy in the room. Clara was by his side, offering quiet support, but Dorian couldn't shake the sense that the art on the walls, the works he had poured himself into, weren't enough to fully separate him from his past. A woman approached him, her smile cool but polite. She was an art critic, one whose opinion carried weight in the circles Dorian was now moving through. Her gaze lingered on the pieces hanging around them, but her words cut deeper. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice smooth but laced with curiosity. "Your work is interesting, but I have to ask, how much of your success can truly be attributed to your talent? How much of it is the result of the Blackwood name you carry?" The question stung, but Dorian had grown used to the uncomfortable conversations. He had expected them. Still, it was the way she said it. "The Blackwood name you carry," as though it was the only thing that mattered, that defined him. He gave her a tight smile. "My art is mine. If you can't see that, I can't help you." But her words echoed in his mind as she walked away. The weight of his last name had been a curse that he had fought so hard to escape. But no matter how far he'd run, it seemed the name was still shackled to him, lingering in the background like a ghost. His paintings weren't just works of art, they were interpretations of his own identity, and yet he realized that others were always looking for that last name, that connection. It had defined him once, and now it threatened to define him again. Later that night, as Dorian and Clara walked through the quiet streets of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that his past was once again threatening to swallow him whole. It was one thing to free himself from the mansion, from the suffocating grip of the Blackwood name, but it was another to truly live as a man free of it. He had broken away, yes, but the world, their world, would never fully let him go. Clara noticed his silence and stopped walking. She turned to face him, her hand gently reaching for his. "What's on your mind, Dorian?" Dorian hesitated for a moment, then spoke the truth that had been weighing on him for so long. "I thought that when I left, when I started this new life, I'd finally be free. But every time I take a step forward, the past pulls me back. It's like it's written into me, like it's all I can ever be." Clara's expression softened, and she stepped closer to him, her eyes warm with understanding. "It's hard, isn't it, to escape something that's been tied to you from the moment you were born?" Dorian nodded, his throat tightening. "I've tried to leave it behind. I've tried to make something of myself without it. But no matter how much I paint, no matter how much I create, it feels like I'll always be the son of Dorian Blackwood. And that legacy will always haunt me." Clara squeezed his hand, her voice unwavering. "The past may have shaped you, Dorian, but it doesn't own you. You've already shown the world who you are. The legacy you've built, the one that's yours, is not tied to the name you were born with. It's tied to the choices you've made, the person you've become." Dorian looked at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. He had found something in Clara that no one else had ever given him. Unconditional acceptance. She didn't care about the Blackwood name. She cared about the man who stood before her, the man who had built a life on his own terms. "You don't know how much that means to me," Dorian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so long trying to outrun it. But I think you're right. I can't keep running. I've already chosen my path." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with love and certainty. "And I'll be here, every step of the way." The next few weeks saw Dorian grappling with the reality of his choice. He couldn't change the past, and he certainly couldn't escape the Blackwood name. But what he could change was how he lived with it. He could choose to stop letting it define him, stop letting it haunt him. He could embrace the fact that the legacy wasn't just about power or wealth. It was also about survival, about adapting, about creating something new even when the world around you insisted on holding you to the past. Dorian returned to his studio with a new sense of purpose. The canvases that had once seemed so chaotic, so fragmented, now felt like the perfect space to channel the deep emotions that swirled inside him. His work no longer felt like an attempt to escape. It felt like an acceptance of who he was, who he had always been. But as he stood before the latest piece he was creating, he realized that this was the final painting that would truly mark his journey, a journey from the shadows of his family's legacy to the light of his own creation. It wasn't just a portrait of the man he had become, it was a representation of everything he had been and everything he had chosen to leave behind. And as he applied the final brushstroke to the painting, he felt something inside him shift. For the first time, he truly felt free. It was the opening night of his latest exhibition. The gallery was filled with the usual crowd, critics, art lovers, and patrons. But this time, something felt different. Dorian was no longer the son of Dorian Blackwood. He wasn't the heir to a dark and twisted legacy. He was simply Dorian Blackwood, an artist, a man who had broken free and had the courage to build his life anew. Clara stood by his side, her hand in his, her smile lighting up the room. As they greeted guests, Dorian found himself truly present, in the moment, no longer haunted by the past, no longer struggling to prove his worth. He had built something for himself, and for the first time he didn't need validation from anyone else. The night passed in a blur of conversations and admiration for his work, but Dorian's thoughts kept returning to one thing, the painting at the heart of the exhibition. The piece that had once felt like a burden, a chaotic expression of his inner turmoil, was now the focal point of the entire show. It was the work that had taken the longest, the one that had cost him the most, emotionally. and it was the one that finally felt like a true representation of who he had become. As the evening wound down, Clara leaned into him, her voice soft. "You did it, Dorian. You've come so far." Dorian smiled, his heart light with the realization that she was right. He had come far. And this was just the beginning. Months had passed since Dorian's exhibition, the one where he had finally embraced his legacy, his past, and everything that had shaped him. The world had responded positively to his art. Critics praised his depth, his honesty, and his ability to channel the darkest parts of himself into something beautiful. Dorian had never sought validation before, but now it felt earned. The Blackwood name, which had once shackled him, had been redefined. He had faced it, accepted it, and rewritten it into something of his own creation. His work now stood as a testament to his journey, to the man he had become after the years of running, the years of rejection. As Dorian stood in front of his latest piece, now hanging in the corner of his studio, he felt a sense of completion. The portrait was simple but profound, an image of a man standing at the edge of a storm, arms open, embracing both the darkness and the light. It was a reflection of Dorian himself, someone who had come to understand the duality within him. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Clara. "I have some news," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "The gallery wants to do a solo show of your work in Paris. It's a big deal. They're offering you a contract." Dorian's heart swelled at the news. Paris. It felt like the next logical step in his journey, the city of art, culture, and freedom. It was a place where he could finally leave his past behind. Not erase it, but honor it by moving forward. The opportunity was everything he had ever wanted. And yet, it wasn't just about the art. It was about the freedom to create without being shackled by his family's legacy. Paris, huh? Dorian smiled, leaning back against his easel. "It seems fitting." Clara laughed on the other end of the line. "It does, doesn't it? I'll be with you every step of the way." "We'll start a new chapter together, Dorian." Dorian felt a surge of emotion, the fear, the doubt, the struggles. He had come so far. He had rebuilt himself from the ashes of his past. And now he was ready to step into the future with Clara by his side, not as the son of Julian Blackwood, but as Dorian Blackwood, the artist, the man who had chosen his own path. The flight to Paris was a quiet one, filled with anticipation. Dorian had made peace with his past, and now with Clara by his side he was ready to embrace the future. It wasn't just the art world he was stepping into. It was a world of endless possibilities, free from the constraints of the legacy that had once defined him. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, Dorian felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The skyline of Paris stretched before him, and for the first time in his life he felt completely at home. The city wasn't just a destination, it was a fresh start, a place where he could create, live, and grow, without the shadows of his past looming over him. Clara squeezed his hand as they exited the plane, her smile warm and encouraging. "This is just the beginning, Dorian." He nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. He had spent so many years running, from his legacy, from his family, from himself. But now he had found his place in the world. A place where he could be true to himself and his art, a place where his past no longer defined him. In the years that followed, Dorian's art flourished in Paris. He held several successful exhibitions across Europe and the United States, and his work became synonymous with the kind of freedom and depth that only someone who had confronted their own darkness could express. His paintings were no longer simply chaotic representations of his inner turmoil. They were his truth, his way of capturing the complexity of the human experience, both light and dark. But it wasn't just the art world that Dorian transformed. He and Clara had built a life together, one that was free of expectations and rooted in love. They traveled, laughed, and created a family of their own, one that wasn't bound by the weight of the Blackwood name. They had written their own story, a story that was rich with purpose and possibility. And every time Dorian stood before a canvas, brush in hand, he felt the freedom to create whatever he chose. No longer bound by the curse of his bloodline, he painted not for fame or fortune, but for himself. And in that freedom, he found peace. The final chapter of Dorian's journey was not defined by the empire he had left behind, or the legacy he had fought to break free from. It was defined by the life he had created for himself. In the quiet moments, as he painted with Clara by his side, he realized that the true legacy he had left behind was one of transformation. He was no longer the son of Julian Blackwood, heir to a cursed name. He was Dorian Blackwood, the artist, the man who had chosen to carve out his own path, to rewrite his story, and break free from the chains of his past, and in doing so he had created a legacy that was entirely his own. The last painting Dorian completed was simple, yet profound, a self-portrait. It was a painting of a man, not defined by the weight of his name or his past, but by the choices he had made. It was a portrait of freedom, of self-acceptance, and of love. As he placed the final brushstroke on the canvas, Dorian stepped back and smiled. The legacy that had once forgotten him had been rewritten, and in doing so, he had found his own place in the world, a place where he was free to be who he truly was. And that was enough. Years later, as Dorian stood in front of his painting, now displayed in a prestigious Parisian gallery, he could hear the echoes of his journey. The legacy that had once haunted him, that had tried to define him, had finally been put to rest. But it hadn't disappeared. Instead, it had become part of him, woven into the fabric of who he was. It had shaped him, but it no longer controlled him. Dorian Blackwood's legacy wasn't one of power, wealth, or darkness. It was a legacy of choice, of breaking free, and of creating a life on his own terms. And as he looked out over the bustling city of Paris, with Clara by his side, he realized that the greatest legacy he could leave behind wasn't his name, but the story he had written for himself. A story of transformation, freedom, and love.